Good morning or good afternoon, students. This is Mr. Fu here. For today, I shall talk about ASEAN's economic cooperation. Now, if you recall, ASEAN was founded in 1967. And if you also recall, in the original declaration, one of the key goals of ASEAN was economic and social and cultural cooperation. But as you know, these were not really ASEAN's true aims. The actual intentions of ASEAN was to counter against communism. So this were just the cover for ASEAN's true aims. Therefore, if you think about it, if ASEAN's main focus was not on economic cooperation and instead on political cooperation, there was actually no real incentive for ASEAN members to cooperate on economic grounds. And more importantly, in 1967, at that point in time, it was highly impractical for ASEAN members to cooperate on economic terms. Why so? Okay, because at that point in time, all the ASEAN members were actually competitors with one another. They focused on exporting their goods and services to US and Western Europe. So if they were competitors trying to sell the same goods to the same countries, therefore there will be no incentive for them to cooperate. Okay? So we can actually split ASEAN's economic cooperation into three phases. And the first phase is from 1967 until 1975. Okay? So we can argue that this first phase of ASEAN's economic cooperation, okay, is mostly a dormant period. There was really nothing much that ASEAN did to focus on economic cooperation. What were the reasons? As I highlighted earlier, it is because all the ASEAN members were competitors. Okay. Furthermore, due to interstate tensions, they did not trust one another. And without this trust, it was difficult to focus on any shared economic interest that they had. So during this period, the United Nations and also Ford Company actually proposed to ASEAN, okay, some plans for regional economic cooperation. But because ASEAN's main focus was not on economic cooperation, these regional economic proposals were eventually declined or rejected by ASEAN. Okay, so all you need to know about the first phase of economic cooperation is that there was a lack of interest, there was competition among the ASEAN states, and there was also a lack of trust and confidence among one another. And that is why in the first phase, there was really nothing concrete carried out in terms of economic cooperation. Now, let us take a look at ASEAN's second phase of economic cooperation, which is from 1976 until about 1992. Now, if you notice the time here, the date 1976, there's a parallel between ASEAN's economic cooperation in the second phase and with what we learned earlier. Can you recall about that? Okay, you should recall that 1976 was also the signing of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in response to a unified Vietnam. So So at this juncture in 1976, ASEAN had been around for about 10 years. So there was a greater realization that now that ASEAN had been surviving for 10 years, there was actually a need to move forward. Okay, to move forward beyond just political cooperation and to attempt some form of economic cooperation. Okay, so you can argue 1976 marked a turning point in ASEAN's economic cooperation because ASEAN states begin to realize that if they are going to focus on the long-term viability of the organization, then they better focus on producing something concrete, and that can be produced through economic cooperation. But on the other hand, you can also argue, okay, even though there seems to be a change, okay, but actually there's also continuities. Okay, so what are the continuities? Throughout the second phase and even the third phase of economic cooperation, ASEAN members still saw one another as competitors. And indeed, to a large degree, it was true, because as I mentioned earlier, they were selling the same goods and services to the same countries. Okay, so to them, from their perspective, it was a zero-sum game. If one country loses out, the other country will gain. So this was a kind of an obstacle against greater economic cooperation. Okay. However, at the same time, there were some successes in the second phase. Okay, so what were the successes? It was the dispute between Singapore and Australia over flight routes. Okay, so the Singapore government claimed that the Australian government was being discriminative against Singapore Airlines, okay, because Australia refused to let Singapore Airlines fly certain air routes in Australia. So Singapore raised this dispute against Australia. That was between 1978 and 1979. So this was a trade or economic dispute. And in this instance, Singapore successfully got the other ASEAN states to support its stand. Okay, so there was actually a unified ASEAN position. And subsequently, okay, Australia backed down and Singapore won the dispute. So you can argue this was a first instance of economic cooperation among the 5 ASEAN members. But we must also recognize that the reason why the 5 states were able to cooperate was because there was nothing much for them to lose. Okay? Because for the 4 other ASEAN states, it was simply about backing Singapore's position. Okay? They did not lose much from it, and therefore they had greater incentive to cooperate. So subsequently, when we see that in certain economic projects, once they realize that their national interests are being threatened, you will see that these ASEAN members will immediately pull back from economic cooperation. Okay? And we'll see this in these various projects here. Okay? These various projects represented ASEAN's failure in economic cooperation. Okay? They are the ASEAN Industrial Project, Okay, ASEAN industrial complementation okay, ASEAN industrial joint venture. Now these projects, okay, the aims were actually quite good. Okay, the aims, okay, was to pool resources among the ASEAN members. And the idea is that once you pool resources, there is economies of scale. You'll be cheaper to produce the goods, and therefore they could export them among themselves or to other countries, and therefore gain economic growth. Okay, what I want you to understand is that the aims, the conceptualization of the projects was actually sound. However, in practice, it's a different story. Okay, in practice and in reality. Okay, so what happened? As I mentioned earlier, okay, ASEAN members were strongly protective of their national interests. So they wanted to protect their own markets. Okay, and were afraid that this ASEAN products here, this ASEAN projects here, would in a way flood or hurt their domestic industries. Okay, because the idea of this ASEAN economic project was to lower the cost of the goods and hopefully sell to within the ASEAN members. But some ASEAN members were afraid that because these goods will be cheaper, this means that their own domestic industries will suffer. Okay, so therefore on paper, all these industrial projects were actually designed very well, but in practice, they did not really take off and actually failed. Okay, so that's all you need to know in summary. The intricate details are in your notes. If any concern about these technical terms you're not sure of, can you please consult your tutor. Now, besides these projects, there's another important initiative created in the 1980s, and that is the PTA. Okay, it was launched in 1980, and PTA stood for Preferential Tariff Agreement. The idea was for ASEAN members to lower their tariff. And if you learn from econs, tariff actually refers to tax on foreign goods. Okay, so once they lower the tariff, it is expected, okay, trade will increase and will lead to higher economic growth. So that was the original idea behind PTA. But again, this initiative actually failed. Okay, why failed? Let's go back to the original interest that we talked about. Okay, all ASEAN members were fiercely protective of their domestic market. Okay, so therefore they refuse to lower their tariffs, or they lowered tariffs only on certain goods. Okay, so therefore, the PTA did not lead to increase in trade among the ASEAN members. Okay, there was no rise in trade. So it's actually seen as a failure among the ASEAN members. And that marked the end of the second phase of economic cooperation. There were various initiatives, but because of the country's own respective national interests, it was too strong to overcome them. Therefore, ASEAN's second phase of economic cooperation was a failure. Okay, let's focus on the third phase of ASEAN's economic cooperation. Okay, the third phase began from 1992 onwards until your syllabus ends in 2000. Okay, what is so significant about the year 1992, or rather the 1990s? Okay, this is certainly something you need to know. It is the post-Cold War period. Okay, so if you think about it, ASEAN was formed as an anti-communist organization. Once the Cold War ended, what was its incentive, or what would be its new aim? So therefore, ASEAN at this point in time was searching for a new rationale to stay together. And economic cooperation could be a strong incentive for all the members to stay together in the organization. In addition, in the early 1990s, there were also other trading blocs formed. Okay, and one of the trading blocs was actually NAFTA, which stands for North American Free Trade Agreement. So from ASEAN members' perspective, it seemed that the world was increasingly divided into various smaller trade blocs. So there was a greater need for ASEAN members to create their own trade bloc so that they could compete with other countries in the world. Okay, so that was the other additional incentive to cooperate together. So therefore, in 1992, ASEAN members agreed to set up AFTA, which simply stands for ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. And under AFTA, there is a CEPT, okay, which stands for Comprehensive Effective Preferential Tariff. The idea was actually quite similar to the previous PTA. Okay, so it's to reduce tariff among ASEAN members and increase trade and therefore economic growth. So this time around, ASEAN members actually learned these mistakes from PTA and deliberately ensured that it was harder for ASEAN members to opt out. Okay, the idea was that if it was harder to opt out, so ASEAN members would therefore try to reduce as much tariffs as possible on their imported goods. So how was this a success? Okay, there were some superficial successes from AFTA. The fact that it was set up was quite an achievement, because again, ASEAN members were able to agree on some commonality. And more importantly, AFTA also accommodated the various states' national interests. And again, we see the ASEAN way at work. Okay? The principles of consultation and consensus and the lowest common denominator. So for example, the newer members of ASEAN such as Laos and Cambodia, they could actually wait for some time before they lower the tariffs. Why so? Because these were the poorest country in ASEAN, and there was acknowledgement that they needed a tariff to help protect their own domestic industries first. Okay, so this allowed ASEAN members to be flexible in reducing their tariffs. But to be honest, that's all about their successes. They're actually more failures than successes, as usual. So what were the failures? Okay, if you think about it, if some members were allowed to delay their tariffs reduction, some members were allowed to immediately drop their tariffs reduction. Okay, this actually meant that AFTA was implemented in an unbalanced manner. So yes, the ASEAN way accommodated their interests, but at the same time, it was also a weakness because not all benefited equally. Okay, if you think about it, Singapore at that point in time was the most prosperous country. Therefore, it wanted to see a faster and rapid implementation after. But other countries such as Malaysia, Cambodia, and Laos were not too happy about, or rather did not have much incentive to agree with AFTA. Okay, and countries such as Malaysia, despite signing on into AFTA, they actually increased their tariff on certain industries such as the petrochemicals. Malaysia's rationale was that it wanted to develop its own domestic petrochemical industry and did not want foreign products to flood its market. Malaysia also placed tariffs on automobiles. Again, the rationale given was that Malaysia wanted to protect its own domestic car industry. Okay, so again, this reflected the weakness of the ASEAN way here. Because basically, each member could choose to interpret what they want from AFTA. And if that's the case, it was very hard for economic cooperation to succeed. Okay, so therefore, in general, AFTA did not result in a rise in intra-ASEAN trade in the 1990s. Okay, there was not much positive outcome from this free trade agreement. Okay, so let's go back to an assessment of ASEAN's economic cooperation over the three phases. Okay, so let's bring all together. Okay, you need to remember that 1967 to 1976 is the first phase of cooperation. Okay, 1976 to 1992 is the second phase. Okay, and 1992 onwards marks the third phase of economic cooperation. Okay, the first phase was characterized by inactiveness. Okay, yet you can argue in 1976 there seemed to be a change. Okay, because there were far more new activities, new economic initiatives. So on the surface there seemed to be a change. But on the other hand, you can also argue there's also continuity. And what was the continuity? ASEAN members, national interests. Okay, which was to protect their domestic markets. And yet again, okay, in the third phase of cooperation, we see there's a new change. Okay, there seemed to be on the surface greater commitment because this was the end of this was the post-Cold War period. So the ASEAN members decided they needed to focus on a new rationale, a new purpose, and economic cooperation could be one way to bond all the ASEAN members together. So they created AFTA. But again, if you think about it, okay, is the change really that drastic? Okay, or is there greater continuity, as you can see here? Okay, because ASEAN members, they still strongly protected their own national interests. Okay, so therefore we can conclude, yes, on the one hand, the ASEAN way was effective in allowing the ASEAN members to come together okay, in a non-threatening manner. They could choose their own pace of reducing tariff. They could choose what kind of goods they could to reduce tariffs as well. So the ASEAN way of accommodating national interests was pretty effective in trying to bring all the ASEAN members on board in cooperating together. But at the same time, if countries choose to cooperate together on economic grounds, there needs to be certain concrete guidelines, certain rules, certain regulations. But the ASEAN way does not have such concrete rules. In the ASEAN way itself, there's no way that countries can be forced to obey the rules. So ASEAN way was ineffective in that sense, okay? Because it allowed members to pursue their own interests, which hindered the regional economic cooperation. Okay, so the ASEAN way is actually both positive and negative for ASEAN. So in summary, when we talk about success and effectiveness of ASEAN economic cooperation, just know that success has a very low bar for ASEAN. Okay, it's a very low bar. The fact that they can cooperate, the fact that they can produce a common agreement, so such as AFTA, perhaps it is already a sign of success. Okay, and there are multiple limitations. Okay, the intra-ASEAN trade did not rise, and ASEAN members were pretty free to pursue their own interests. Okay, so I think that is a rather balanced assessment of ASEAN economic cooperation. Okay, a very low bar for success, unfortunately, mostly failures.